Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes.
We wanted to draw your attention to our crowdfunding page on Patreon. If you've been enjoying Always Take Notes, please do consider supporting us there. It helps us to keep the podcast going.
If you support us on Patreon, you can get a great selection of rewards, including a shout out on the show and a selection of successful magazine pictures.
If you pledge $10 a month, you also get a free 2-month trial to Otter, worth $26, alongside the other rewards. Otter offers automated transcription and live note-taking for in-person and virtual meetings. I found it to be a huge help when organising interview material.
Thanks again for supporting Always Take Notes. Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Rachel and myself spoke with the novelist Mohsin Hamid.
We spoke to Mohsin about moving from Pakistan to America, then from the corporate to the literary world, about writing The Reluctant Fundamentalist and the Shadow of 9/11, and his new book, The Last White Man.
It's a great episode and we hope you enjoy it. Mohsin, great to have you on the podcast. We wanted to start with the new novel, The Last White Man. So it's about a white man who wakes up to find himself dark-skinned and how the phenomenon then spreads more widely in society. Both Kafka and Jose Saramago have been mentioned as possible models, but what was your own point of departure with the idea? We saw that you'd mentioned The Fall by Camus.
I've always been interested in the mid-20th century, early 20th century modernist writers, people like Virginia Woolf and Jorge Luis Borges and Camus and Kafka and Calvino, and Saramago, who comes later, in a sense is following on from that tradition. And one thing which I found quite interesting about that tradition is that those writers were writing in a time of war and upheaval, technological change, when the Industrial Revolution had meant that work had become profoundly different, and also a rising sense of polarization. And they responded by trying to figure out, how the novel, how stories, how literature worked, and taking it apart and building it back together. And so, for me, that project, I guess, continues and seems quite appropriate to the times we find ourselves in now. And I guess for me, the starting point is, I think that what we call reality is perhaps less real than we imagine. So the color red doesn't actually exist. Red is a way in which our brains represent to each of us individually that light is being reflected off of an object at a particular wavelength. Similarly, ourself, the more we find out about how our brains and minds work through neuroscience, etc., we discover that, as the ancients have told us, our self is largely a kind of fiction. It's something we come up with and are constantly playing with and changing. So for me, the idea of having a slight rupture in reality as the starting point of the novel, of taking something that's very familiar but skewing it ever so slightly, creates a kind of fertile place for the imagination to go. And it's I guess a jumping off point that Kafka, and before Kafka, many writers, the Arabian Nights, the Greek mythology, ancient literature from all over the world has dabbled with. And I thought it was appropriate to what I wanted to do.
I read in one piece that the idea itself, you've been sort of mulling it over for about 20 years. Is that right?
Yeah. I suppose I had an Anders-like experience 20 years ago. So in July of 2001, I moved from New York to London. And I had lived at that point 18 of my first 30 years in the West, mostly in the US. And when the attacks of September 11th, 2001 took place, I had been somebody who, although I had brown skin and a Muslim name, I wouldn't have sort of considered discrimination to have been a particularly important factor in my life. I was aware of it in society around me, but I didn't, think of it as much more than a very minor annoyance as far as I was concerned myself. And, living in cosmopolitan cities and having studied at particular universities and having a well-paying job, it didn't bother me too much in my own day-to-day. And then suddenly I found, after 9/11, that, I was being stopped at airports and held for hours at immigration, and people were getting nervous when I boarded a bus, unshaven on the weekend with a backpack, and sometimes they would switch seats. And I realized how almost overnight I had been imagined into this different category. And I spent a lot of time thinking, I want things to go back to how they were before 9/11. Not to be in this different category, to be sort of just a person again. And I felt like I'd lost something. And as time went by, and I considered, what I had lost, I thought, maybe I've lost a kind of partial whiteness, that if whiteness in a country like the UK or the US is the ability to just be a person, so just to be a human being with nothing else attached. I had partaken of some of the benefits of that, and now I was finding that I wasn't just a person. I was a person who also came with a sense of threat and suspicion and other connotations that I didn't like. And I think when I discovered that one's identity can be imagined onto one, racially, ethnically, by others so easily, it's something I wanted to respond to in fiction. And I addressed, I guess, the specifics of mutual suspicion between sort of quote-unquote Westerners and quote-unquote Muslims in The Reluctant Fundamentalist, which plays with this idea of how suspicion gets constructed and how we are constructing it ourselves. But the underlying question of one's race or one's kind of identity, and how it's this sort of imaginary thing and it gets placed onto us, but then once it's imagined into existence, it has a real effect, is something I still wanted to deal with. And eventually, when I thought of this particular way in of a man who wakes up dark, who had been light, and a world where this begins to spread, that seemed like the way for me to tackle that particular story.
And other responses to the novel have suggested it as a kind of parable or having a fable-like quality. And particularly this feature in your writing of kind of using anonymity or trimming away details so things aren't placed as well, that also came up in How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia. Could you tell us about that idea? Is that something you're deliberately trying to do by shearing away some of the contact points?
I think people often say, they use words like parable or allegory. I'm not quite sure if I would use those terms myself. I understand what they mean. I don't disagree with them. But when I think of an allegory, I think of something which is saying one thing and talking about something else. For example, Orwell comes to mind, and some other writers come to mind who will, writing about colonialism, describe a group of animals, for example. So this novel is sort of what it's about. So it is actually about a race, and the characters are experiencing a loss of race. So allegory doesn't quite feel right, and parable, is sort of a kind of morality tale, almost by definition, sort of small in scope. At least it feels like that to me. And I think something of that is of interest to me, but again, it doesn't feel quite right. But I think what people are connecting to is that the novels have an intentional de-specificity and intentional gaps built into them. Not just this novel, but Exit West and How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia, very much so. And in this novel, those gaps and that de-specificity work in particular ways. So we have two characters who are named, Anders and Una, but no other character is named. We have an unnamed city in an unnamed country. We don't really know what Anders looks like when he changes. What are these people looking like post-change as the world, as people darken? How are they darkening? We also maintain a kind of tight focus on the domestic drama, really, of Anders' relationship, of three love stories. The love story between Anders and Una, between Una and Una's mother, and between Anders and Anders' father. And these three love stories are really the very heart of the novel. And the rest of what happens in the town, in the country, is happening sort of off camera, so to speak. You get a feeling for it. It's sort of hinted at, but it happens outside. And the reason that the novel is written like this and that there's so much space left open, so much stuff not described, is because I feel that the particular strength of written fiction among the three, or the various mass-reproduced storytelling forms that we have at the moment. The dominant ones would be television and cinema. And then, literature, I guess, is the third, or one of, or perhaps there are more than that, but those three come to mind. And among these three most common forms, in literature, you see something quite different from cinema and television. In cinema and television, you are a viewer who sees something and hears something that looks and sounds much like the world actually does. And of course, there's some imagination required on the part of the viewer, but you're seeing the world and you're hearing the world. When you read a book, you encounter something that doesn't look anything like the world. It's letters and spaces and punctuation marks against a white field. And you, the reader, are animating that with your imagination into what you call a novel. The reader is really making the novel. A novelist kind of writes a half novel, which is a series of prompts. And the reader takes that half novel and imagines it into people and ideas and emotions and the way things look, etc. there's a degree of co-creation involved in reading, which I think far exceeds that in the other storytelling forms. And that suggests to me that one of the things that literature can usefully do, in our present moment, is to afford people a sort of maximum opportunity to do this, to use their imagination, to imagine into existence a novel, and to think of a novel as an invitation to sort of play collective make-believe, like children, where you agree that you're going to play house or pirate or astronaut, and then you start playing, and you come up with some ideas, and this tree is the mast of a ship, and those leaves are the fins of sharks, and that tree is the ship we have to get to, and suddenly you're in this world. I think what a novel does is it allows readers to do that kind of participatory, imaginative, co-creative play as adults, which is something we almost never do as adults. And so I've written this novel really so that the reader has a lot of space to imagine it into existence. Much of the shape the novel takes will depend on how the reader imagines it into existence. And what hopefully the reader becomes aware of is both what they did imagine into existence, why they imagined that way, and whether they wish to continue imagining it that way. So hopefully the effect is a little bit different than what we might think of as an allegory or a parable, but something more like a self-aware a game of make-believe, between two kids, and I think that's quite useful, because race is such an uncomfortable terrain that it strikes me that it can be valuable to be able to enter into an imaginary realm associated with it, in solitude, without anyone else around, participating in this novel that a novelist has written, but really making a lot of it yourself. So that's I guess how I thought about this question of not being so specific and being a bit vague.
I think the theme of imagination and existence leads very nicely on to the next question, which is your kind of role as novelist. And I saw in a previous interview you said, I want to try to imagine a future I'd like to live in, and then write books and do things that, in my own small way, make it more likely that that future will come to exist. Could you kind of unpack that idea with regards to your new novel?
So I'm 51 years old. And, for probably the first 30 years of my life, I had the general sense that the world was getting better. And I might have been mistaken, I probably was mistaken, but many people in the latter part of the 20th century seemed to feel the same thing. Not everybody, and of course there were wars and all sorts of horrors and catastrophes going on. But there seemed to be this global narrative that over time we would have less inequality, we would have more ability to protect our environment, we would have less racism and discrimination, we'd be more inclusive and more open and more prosperous, really. And somewhere in the last couple of decades, that worldview has come to seem, to many people, ridiculous. When I talk about thinking this way to young students in high school or college when I'm giving a lecture, and I ask for questions and we're talking afterwards, oftentimes they will tell me that they've never felt like that. It doesn't feel like that at all. And I think all over the world, there's a sense that the future no longer looks very promising. And what's happened as a result of that is, because we find it difficult to imagine a future that is better, the future now looks like it will be one of environmental degradation, of sort of rampant nationalisms and ethnic chauvinisms and divisions, of increasing inequality, of so many things that don't look good to so many of us. The danger of that is we wind up, in a sense, turning away from the future. And the future starts to repel us. And we then are easily attracted by nostalgic narratives. And these are narratives that take us back to the past, that say things were better 20 years ago, before the immigrants arrived, or 50 years ago when America was more white, or 1,000 years ago in the golden age of Islam, or the age of Hindutva before Muslims arrived in India, or whatever. In place after place, there's some kind of nostalgic narrative that tells us that some point in the past actually should be our destination. And this gives birth to a particular kind of politics, a sort of reactionary politics that imagines that we really should go back to this place. The problem is the place often didn't exist. It's nothing like what we imagined it to be. And even if it did exist, it may not have been very good. And even if it did exist and was good, we can't go there. in the same way that I might decide that being 18 years old is superior to being 51. But if I tried to suddenly act and be like an 18-year-old, it'd be a kind of monstrous, exercise. So how do you unmake the omelet? Like, I don't think you can. You can't go back to the egg. So this nostalgic politics, which I think is now the dominant form of politics in much of the world, either the leader or the leader of opposition of most countries seems to be somebody articulating a nostalgic view like this. I think that it's difficult to resist that view and that kind of politics unless one can begin to consider a future that's desirable. How do you combat nostalgic narratives if you can't have a non-nostalgic, if you can't have an optimistic view? Now, I think there's a difference between a kind of naive optimism, which says, it doesn't really matter what we do, things are going to be fine. I don't believe in that at all. But I think that it is possible to have a kind of critical optimism, which says that if we do certain things, and if we imagine in certain ways, we can conceive of inclusive, desirable, plausible futures that we would like to go towards. And one of the things that we've seen throughout history is that this does happen. Incredibly diverse communities do come into existence. The Roman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Ottoman Empire, Soviet Union, and many contemporary countries have had moments where it seemed like there was a narrative that was bringing people together. When that narrative switches into a kind of threat narrative, that anybody a little bit different from you is a threat, it falls apart very quickly. Russians and Ukrainians live side by side for centuries, seemingly quite peacefully, and suddenly, they can't. Similarly in the former Yugoslavia or in India and Pakistan at partition in 1947. So all of this is preamble to saying that I think it's interesting as a novelist to consider exploring these sort of optimistic potential destinations. In Exit West, what I tried to do in a way was to gaze into the migration apocalypse. What if everybody could move? And ask a question which was, would it be apocalyptic? Maybe it wouldn't, actually. Maybe it would be in some ways better than what we have now. And similarly, in, The Last White Man, what I'm, I suppose, trying to do is to ask the question of, if we were unable to sort each other by race, if we didn't have that mechanism, we couldn't quite tell who somebody was on the basis of race, and we had to let go of that, what might occur? And would that be something that we could, get to? And if we got to, would it be better than where we are? And at least offer that up as a possibility for the reader to consider.
Could we roll back and actually kind of following on from that point to your own early life and this cross-cultural experience that you had growing up partially in the United States and partially in Pakistan? Could you explain how that worked for you, and then particularly where the origins of your literary interests fitted into that?
So I left Pakistan for America at the age of 3 in 1974. My father was a university professor, was and is, and he went to do his PhD in California. And so my mother, my father, and I moved out there. My sister was born there. I arrived in California fluent in Urdu and Punjabi, but not speaking a word of English. And my parents report that I was once sort of wandering outside the townhouse where we lived. And a couple of days after we arrived, and all the townhouses were identical. And eventually my mother heard sort of crying and came to the front door. And I was standing in front of the house next to ours, in front of a very sort of befuddled neighbor who was looking down at this little Pakistani boy. And I was looking up at him, and he wasn't my mother. And I was surrounded by a group of children who were, I'm imagining them as sort of like a little Benetton ad, sort of a model United Nations of diversity, kids from all over the world who had come on the Stanford campus, because it was really quite incredible in the 1970s. It felt like, you had sort of shrunk the UN General Assembly down to a bunch of 5-year-olds and put them, barefoot onto this campus. And so there were kids from all over the world standing around me, and they asked my mother, what's wrong with him? Why can't he speak? And she said, he can't speak. And why can't he speak properly? She said, he can speak properly, he just can't speak English yet. And my mother and father tell me that after that, I didn't really speak for a month. And I sat in front of a television and just kept to myself. I was, in the house with my parents, but I didn't talk. They were quite concerned. And a month later, when I next spoke, I was speaking in English in complete sentences with an American accent. And it wasn't until I was 1980, when we moved back to Pakistan, that my family realized that I didn't speak a word of Urdu anymore. I'd completely forgotten Urdu. So I returned to Pakistan as a 9-year-old, at a time unlike today, when phone calls were incredibly expensive, international flights were incredibly expensive, mail took forever to arrive. And I never really had any contact with any of my friends from my previous childhood, ever again. It was a complete rupture. And I didn't speak Urdu, so I was basically this Californian kid arriving into Lahore. And then once again, I had to learn the language and figure out how to sort of become chameleon-like and blend in, which eventually I managed. And then in 1989, I came to America at the age of 18, and then Britain at 30, and then back to Pakistan around the age of 40. And so I've been, I guess, moving around throughout my whole life. And as a result of this, having spent, a decade or more in 3 different countries, the UK, the US, and Pakistan, I'm a thoroughly sort of mongrelized, hybridized human being. And I think I've become quite sensitive to the feeling that that purity, that some kind of purity of the original people and one's belonging to that original group is a requirement for membership in a society, because by its very nature, that seems to preclude people like me. So whether it's in Pakistan or America or Britain, I guess I've always been very sensitive to the notion that societies are starting to move towards, the original folk, the original people who are the true people of that place. And I think a lot of my fiction has been in response to that. Maud Smoke, my first novel, was a look at sex and drugs and contemporary life in 1990s Lahore, among young people in a particular urban sliver, written from a standpoint that was both an insider sort of Lahori standpoint, but also a half American standpoint, because I'd lived so many of my years in the US. And then The Reluctant Fundamentalist sort of reversed that. That was a novel that was about America, written in many ways as an insider from America, but with a point of view that was sort of half Pakistani. And my subsequent books have, I guess, in a way, been less specifically tied to places. They've been a little bit vague in terms of where they are, and they've dealt with in different ways, migration and displacement and changing identity and how we're perceived. All of which, I guess, are the themes that have really defined my life.
You studied at Princeton when you returned to the US as a teenager, and you read international relations, but also did some literature classes. What was the experience of being taught by Toni Morrison, who later sort of gave you feedback on Moth Smoke, and Joyce Carol Oates? What was that experience like?
So I arrived at university in 1989, and I had no idea that you could take, creative writing classes. I didn't go to Princeton thinking that I would do creative writing. And this woman across the hall from me in the dormitory where I was living my first year was taking a creative writing class, and she told me she was taking this. And I asked her, what do you mean? She said, well, we write, short stories, fiction, a few stories every semester. And I said, and it's a regular class, like every other class, history or economics or politics. She said, yeah. And it's also pass fail. And I thought, this is an incredible sort of scam. Like, how could this exist? I have to try this. And so I applied for a creative writing class, and I was accepted into one. And then I wound up taking 2 semesters with Joyce Carol Oates, and my final semester of university with Toni Morrison. And something happened, that was very important for me, because I never thought that I could be a writer. It didn't seem to me like within the realm of really possibility. I didn't know any writers. I loved books. I read lots of books, but I just somehow assumed that somebody else wrote them. And it was only really in university that it occurred to me that, maybe I could be the person who wrote them, or one of the people who writes them. And when you take classes with people like Joyce Carol Oates and Toni Morrison, and they take your work seriously because they took their students' work seriously, you begin to believe that, maybe you have permission to do this. And so perhaps the biggest thing that I got from university was just the permission to believe that I could be a writer. And once I began believing that, it's sort of what I really wanted to do with my life. In terms of what they taught me specifically, one thing that I often say about Toni Morrison's class is that she used to say that, you need to keep your reader a half heartbeat ahead of the action of your novel. when they shouldn't know what's coming next, but when it happens, it should feel inevitable. And of course, in cinema, that's done with the camera work and with the score, etc. But in written fiction, it's done, a great deal of that work is done formally in terms of the sentences that you use and the cadences you set up and other things that you're doing that are creating an environment for the reader to accept the inevitability of what's happening. And that's something which I guess I've continued to do, to this day. And it informs, for example, the sentences of The Last White Man, which are built the way they are, really to serve that purpose of creating the environment for the reader to do or to accept what is about to happen.
Hi, it's Artemis, the producer of Always Take Notes. I hope you're enjoying Simon and Rachel's conversation with the novelist Mohsin Hamid. It's time for the next instalment of our segment where we hear bonus material from previous guests of the show. So this week we're going to hear from the journalist and author Maggie Ferguson, and she's going to share a piece of advice she actually was given at the start of her career and she wanted to share with you.
I think I actually had the best piece of advice when I had my strange Oxbridge term as an Etonian. And one of the masters there, who was my private tutor, asked me to read Middlemarch, and I did. And we got together to talk about it. And he said, "Did you like it?" And I was very gushing and said, "I loved it. It was fantastic." And he said, "Why?" And I just wasn't used to being asked that kind of question. So I got myself in a complete knot about it. And eventually he just said very calmly, "Do you think it might be because Dorothea is a wonderful woman?" And I thought, my God, you're able to say something as simple as that. And that would be my best piece of advice. Have the courage of your convictions, say what you think, and it doesn't need to be very sophisticated.
That was Maggie Ferguson, and if you were interested in what Maggie had to say, you can listen to our full interview with her via our website, which is www.alwaystakenotes.com. But for now, back to Simon and Rachel's conversation with Mohsin Hamid.
Could you tell us about your immediate postgraduate career with these parallel tracks? So on the one hand, getting corporate jobs at McKinsey, going to Harvard Law School, and on the other hand, breaking through as a fiction writer. And particularly, we love on the show to get into the kind of nitty gritty of how people got an agent, how they went around getting a publishing deal and that sort of thing. So how, firstly, why were you, I suppose, taking this 2-track route? And then how did it work out in practice?
So even when I began dreaming that I could be a writer, which began from at university, I still had no thought whatsoever that I could make a living as a writer. And so I deferred my law school admission for a year and wrote another draft of my first novel, which I had written a first draft of in Toni Morrison's class in my last year of college. And then I went to law school at Harvard, and I discovered, weeks into it that I didn't really like the law. But a combination of, not having the courage to stop doing it, also now beginning to have taken on quite a bit of debt to pay for the thing, and the sense that I still had to make a living somehow. So might as well see this through. And I kept working on my novel at law school. Eventually, I found a professor who taught a class called Law and Literature, and I went to him and said, "Look, for my third year thesis, I don't really want to write about the law. I'm working on this novel. I'd like to submit this novel as my law school thesis." And he said, "Look, I really don't want to read another thesis about the law. If you can find even the flimsiest of arguments that can give us a reason for how we can accept this as a law school thesis, I'm very happy to advise you." And at that point, the novel had completely changed. It was unrecognizable from what I guess it began as. It had taken on the form of a trial. And I remember watching Pulp Fiction by Quentin Tarantino in my first year of law school, and really liking that kind of disaggregated way of telling a narrative with sort of broken parts. And my own novel had sort of splintered into these different people telling their stories, and it became this trial. And so And so I said, look, that, a trial is about trying to arrive at truth through sort of competing, contradictory claims. And this novel is exactly the same thing. He says, fantastic, write that on a page and we're good to go. And so that became my law school thesis. And then I didn't want to work in a law firm, and McKinsey had begun recruiting from a law school at this time. And so I got a job as a consultant. And then I was working as a consultant, and I think it was the first year retreat of the consulting firm where they took us all up to Vermont for some skiing. And the head of the office was holding up the bar late at night. And there were only a few people left standing, and I was one of them. And he said, so Mohsin, how are things going? And it was during the .com era, and people were leaving consulting in droves to try their hand at becoming billionaires and starting their .com companies. And I guess McKinsey was keen to keep people that they liked. And he said, what would make you really happy here? Like, what makes the perfect job? And I said, well, I'm writing this novel, and I'd love to take 3 months off unpaid, every year to work on it. And, it was at that point in the evening when inevitably he said, that sounds, completely doable. Let's talk about it when we get back to the office. And so I began this sort of 9-month consulting, 3-month not consulting, writing, consulting, hybrid life. I finished my first book, published it. I did a kind of 9 months non-consulting, 3-month consulting year. And then eventually decided to try my hand at just, writing fiction full time. Quickly discovered that my second novel was probably going to take about as long as my first, which was 7 years, and then got another job in consulting in London. And my conditions were that I would only work 3 days a week. So I did that for a bit. And then I negotiated down to 2 days a week and 1 day a week. And, in terms of my professional career, I think a lot of people in that business, their goal was to sort of make more and more money over time. And my goal was to make exactly the same amount of money, enough to pay my rent and support living in London or New York, while working less and less days and having more time free to write books. And, after, I guess in around 2009, so 16 years from when I started my first novel, on the back of The Art and Fundamentalist, I finally felt able to write for a living and moved to Pakistan to do that. You also asked about, how did I get an agent and how did that process work? And so I'd been, my first novel, Moth Smoke, I wrote a draft in college, and I took a year off and wrote a draft afterwards, and wrote multiple drafts in law school. And in a way, each of these drafts was a different book. So it wasn't that a draft for me was I'd have a Microsoft Word document and I would edit it. I'd write a draft, it wouldn't work, and then I'd write another novel, the same basic story, but with no real sentences in common. And so each year I'd be writing another novel, trying to write this novel properly. 7 novels in 7 years, I guess. Well, the last couple of novels were more like traditional drafts. They were built on like a 4th or 5th draft that actually at that point it was working. But I didn't show it to anybody. I showed it to my writer friends who were also like me, hoping to get published one day. And then one of them was in this Radcliffe publishing workshop where I guess you go when you want to get a job in the publishing business. And a literary agent came and spoke to them about agenting. And he handed, without telling me, the printout of my manuscript to this agent. And then this agent got in touch and said, look, I've read your manuscript. Your friend gave it to me up in Boston, and I'd like to represent you. And there was a woman in my office at McKinsey whose mother was an agent. So I said, could you please ask your mother if this person is like a legitimate agent? I don't know anything about this stuff. Is this somebody I should be wanting to be represented by? And she said, she came back to me a day later saying, my mother's never heard of her, but she wants to see your manuscript. Now, I don't know if she really had never heard of her, but she asked for my manuscript. And then she handed my manuscript to her former assistant, who had just recently begun commissioning writers of his own, I think that year. And he basically asked to see me, and he said, look, I'd like to represent you. And we talked it through, and we really hit it off. And then he gave me some edits. I did some minor revisions. He did an auction. And there were, I think, 2 or 3 publishing houses. He sent out maybe 10. Most of them passed, but 2 or 3 seemed interested. And of the 2 or 3 seemed interested, FSG in the US, it was a US auction, was one of the sort of most famous, I guess, literary publishers, they also offered the least money. And my agent, I think showing the good judgment for which I will, always rely on him, said, I think you should go for the lowest bid. I think you should go with FSG. I think it's the right home for this book. They're a serious literary publisher, and I think that's what matters. Forget about how much money it is. None of the advances were very much. It wasn't like this was millions of dollars. It was probably, I don't know, 10, 15,000 versus maybe $20, $25,000. I don't remember the exact numbers, but in that kind of ballpark. And so I went with FSG, and there I met my editor, Becky, and she worked with me to revise the book. The most editing I ever did with an editor was on my first book. And since then, which is 1998, the book came out in 2000. I've had the same editor and the same agent ever since, almost a quarter century now. Becky moved from FSG to Harcourt, and from Harcourt to Riverhead, so I followed her each time. So my first 3 books in the U.S. had different publishers for each book, but since then I've been with Riverhead, and I guess for other writers who are thinking about their careers, my advice really is to figure out how to be able to write every day and support yourself while doing that. To give yourself a few years or even a decade or two to make it work. And to really focus on getting, somebody you truly trust as your agent and editor. And then once you find them, not to let go and just to stay with those people.
To remain on the subject of money, actually, which is something that we ask every guest about, are you still doing some consultancy work? Because I know you were working for Wolf Ollins, I think, in New York a bit, one day a week.
Well, in London, actually. Yeah, I was with Wolf. I wound up running the Wolf Ollins London office on my 3-day-a-week calendar almost 15 years ago, I think, briefly. And then I continued to freelance with them, and at one point, a consultant that I'd actually been involved in hiring, who later wound up running the London office and then ran the whole firm, was CEO. He said, what if we formalize your role as chief storytelling officer, and we could just bring you in on sort of interesting jobs, and you sort of talk to CEOs about narrative and brand and whatnot. And so I did that for a while. I haven't done that now for some years. I do, I suppose, a little bit of consulting, but in different ways. I do it for family members who are starting a restaurant or starting a business. I've advised the Lahore Literary Festival. I helped set up the Lahore Biennale. And I think what I like about it is, as a novelist, you basically sit in a room all by yourself for years, which is an incredibly lonely thing to do. And what I've always enjoyed about consulting is you get to solve problems together with people every day. I suppose if I hadn't become a father, and my wife and I, both work, and so we divide the house spouse duties between us, and so I have a lot of, I guess, childcare in my life, and figuring out homework and taking people to class and this, that, and the other. So that gets me out of my solitary world. If I didn't have that, I think I probably would still want to be doing consulting or something like it, maybe teaching on a more regular basis. Aside from the financial side of things. And I think it can be a relief sometimes to not be relying on your fiction to make a living, or entirely relying on your fiction, because you can, in a sense, be more willing to take risks and less frightened by the risks, because you think, okay, well, worst case scenario, I can still pay my rent. But aside from the financial part of it, I think there's a sort of psychological or psychic part of it where it's very, very difficult to be a writer for many people. It's not a very natural thing to be so cut off from humanity. So I've always liked having something that forces me to deal with other people every day, and I miss it when I don't have something like that.
Could you tell us now about The Reluctant Fundamentalist and its kind of path to being this phenomenon that it was? I saw, I think, in another interview that you were working on it pre 9/11. In fact, we're discussing it at a dinner literally a few days before the attack, and then said, well, I better carry on with it after the attacks took place. But could you tell us in particular about, when it became clear to you that this was going to be the global smash that it was?
I mean, it never was really clear to me. It was sort of strange because the book began before 9/11 as a story of this young Muslim guy working in a sort of corporate job in New York City who has this failed love affair, grows a beard, and goes back to Pakistan. And in his growing a beard, there's some mutual suspicion that happens. And I remember showing it to my agent, and he didn't really like it, and he said, I don't really buy this tension, this Muslim American, why isn't he, people not accepting him, and then perhaps a month or two later, 9/11, the attacks of 9/11 happened, and my agent sort of, a month or two after that said, that book about the tension between the Muslim guy and America, let's go back to that. But I sort of, at that point, thought, I'm not sure that book stands anymore, because you would read that book now and you would say, this is sort of a preamble to 9/11. This is sort of to say, you read that book after 9/11 thinking, oh, what you're saying is this happens and then there's 9/11. 9/11 had totally, I guess, overwhelmed this, and that book, I guess, was more like a parable. Perhaps it was a very, sort of out of focus, gentle tale. And I spent many years continuing to try to set the book before 9/11. I didn't want to deal with 9/11 in the novel, but it became impossible. How can you deal with these themes? It always felt like either the book would bring 9/11 into the action of the novel, or it would be sort of set up for 9/11. It couldn't escape the gravity of 9/11. And eventually I figured out that I had to have both Pakistan and America in the novel simultaneously. And then this sort of dramatic monologue where Chinggez meets this American in Pakistan, but tells a story that's set in America. So the novel is simultaneously in both places throughout. And this kind of dramatic monologue where the American doesn't get to speak. And so the reader has to imagine what's being said. And the reader has to sort of come up with, is Chinggez a threat? Is he being threatened by the American? Is neither happening? Are both happening? How do I feel about this? And the novel, in a way, is this sort of thriller where nothing thrilling really happens. The thriller aspect is created by playing with the degree of suspicion and fear that was so rampant in all of us, really, in the first few years after 9/11. And then when it came time for publication, it had, in a sense, two very different publications. In the US, what happened was that Barnes & Noble decided that this was going to be a book they were really going to champion. And so they put it on the front of their bookstores, they made it part of this program, and they really promoted it, and it went onto the US sort of bestseller list. And then it sort of, as any book, I guess, promoted into high sales, as they often happens, it sort of, I guess, started to come down from there. In the UK, it was a very quiet publication. I wasn't particularly interviewed. It didn't get that much. There was almost nobody cared, really. Although I lived in London, so I was living in London, and I had become a British citizen, and yet I was being described as a Pakistani novelist, and nobody really interviewed me, and nobody really cared. But the book just sort of trickled around along with almost no readers, and then it started to get readers, a few months later. And it was helped along, I think, by being shortlisted for the Booker Prize, which got some more attention and more interviews. And people began to, I guess, encounter it. And then it was just a sort of slow build. It was probably selling much more in its second and third and fourth years than it was in its first. And so in the UK, it was a kind of word of mouth, very slow building bestseller. In the US, it was this sort of heavily promoted bestseller, which then tapered off. So it was really two very different publications. I never knew it was going to be this sort of big bestseller. In a way, I suppose one hopes every novel will be a big bestseller, and one also knows that it's very, very unlikely that any of them are going to be bestsellers. And so you have that that sort of twin sense of ridiculous optimism and crushing pessimism at the same time. But yeah, that's how that book sort of came about. And what that book did give me was, finally I was able to imagine writing for a living, and then moved to Pakistan to do that.
We're coming towards the end of our time, so a kind of penultimate question from me. Could we jump ahead to Exit West? I was interested to see that you've cited children's literature as a kind of particular influence on that book. Could you explain that idea a little?
Yeah, when I was, I guess my first three novels, Maud Smoke, The Russian Fundamentalist, and How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia, each explored the nature of the reader-writer relationship and have a direct address of using you in different ways. You are cast as this kind of judge, judging this surreal trial in Maud Smoke. You is the person that Chinggez is addressing, possibly the reader, this unnamed American stranger in a bazaar in Lahore, in The Russian Fundamentalist. And in How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia, the main character is you. And it's also a novel about the relationship between the reader and the writer, in a sense, the most directly about that of all my books. What I figured out, I guess, after doing these three you novels, and I was living in Pakistan at the time, and I started thinking, am I writing in a way that presupposes that people have had similar kind of educational and other background to me, that they have a certain interpretive apparatus that they bring to novels? Is there something weirdly elitist about my approach? Writing novels that depend, in a sense, on misleading the reader and creating attention out of that misleading seemed interesting to me, and I wanted to do it. But am I missing something by doing that? And so what I wanted to do, I guess, in Exit West was to try to write a novel that actually said what it meant, that sort of had the decoder ring for the book built into the book. Now, that might seem like a very simple thing to do, except I had never done it before, and I had no idea how to do it. And so I thought, who does this well? And then I thought of children's literature, where very often the book is sort of saying what it means, and where, in a sense, you're invited to be on the side of the characters. You're cheering for Bilbo or for Wilbur the pig and Charlotte, as they face their various nemeses, and you're on their side. And so Exit West was a novel that was written like that. It was a novel written to say what it meant, and to, in a sense, invite the reader to be on the side of those characters. And that's how I figured out how to write it.
And a final question from me is kind of circling back to 9/11 and the response to it. You've talked, just now to us and elsewhere about how this was a huge inflection point in your life, and it changed the way you were perceived. Do you feel any ambivalence in that it also, in some ways, was a kind of root of huge success for you as well, and that your response to Reluctant Fundamentalist is perceived in many quarters as the definitive literary response and so forth, and your career has kind of reached a huge dimension on the back of that? Yeah, as you say, it also kind of stripped, to an extent, your citizenship in Western society. So is that a tension that you're aware of?
No, not really. I mean, I think there's no doubt. I remember Toni Morrison once said to me, and I said, I'm going to law school. We're having lunch, and I said, I'm going to law school, and I think that I'll do law school and also trying writing novels. Do you think that's a good idea, or should I just go off and write books? She said, I think it's a good idea to go to law school. And I must have looked pretty, crestfallen when she said that, because maybe I'd secretly been hoping that no, with your blinding talent, you certainly should only write fiction. No, but she said, I think you should. You need a way to make a living. And Toni Morrison, remember, had worked as an editor for many, many years, and then a university professor while she was a writer. So she wasn't being dismissive. I think she was being actually very helpful. But she also said, but you never know. Maybe one day Pakistani writers or whatever kind of writers she said some sort of writer will be the flavor of the month. And so in that sense, I guess, there's a question which is, did 9/11 make the Reluctant Fundamentalist the flavor of the month, and was my, writing career thereafter, connected to that? Who knows? I mean, certainly without the Reluctant Fundamentalist, there would never have been, without 9/11, there would never have been Reluctant Fundamentalist. But I think I would have been pretty happy to have continued in the direction that I had gone with Motsmoke, which was a novel that was, really a very different kind of book, exploring a very hedonistic side of South Asian life that became this kind of cult hit in Pakistan and India, and was very different from a lot of other books that had been published before that. And I think that was a different direction I might have gone down. But weirdly enough, I think the same kinds of formal concerns were already present in that book, and the same way of thinking about the novel. I think the main difference is perhaps that, I might still have a job and write novels alongside that. But would I be doing the kinds of things formally and engaged with the kinds of things that I'm engaged in now? I suspect I would, because even without 9/11, the tensions that had begun to sort of appear and the cracks in our globalized society were appearing. And I think a lot of my fiction has been reacting to that. And I guess another part of that is to say, partly I'm probably driven to write fiction by not being comfortable with the world as it is. And since I'm not comfortable with the world that it is, I try to enter into an imaginary world of making my own stories and to nudge the world along, I guess, in my own way. Had the world been a world I was more comfortable in living in, maybe I wouldn't be a fiction writer. But in that case, I might not have regretted it at all, because I may not have felt that urge to write fiction if the world was a world where I felt immediately at ease and very comfortable where things were headed.
Final question, really quickly. because I know we have to let you go. Appropriately enough, about brevity. You've said you want to write the kind of novels that people can read in an afternoon or in a day, and I confess to having done that on more than one occasion with one of your books. Why do you think that's the kind of format or length that you want to work with?
I think that there's something about, an oral storytelling tradition that's very attractive to me. The idea that you sort of sit around the fire at the end of the evening with your clan and somebody tells a tale. And the fire burns for 2 or 3 or 4 hours, and you get deeper into the night, and the story is done. It's an encounter between two human beings that has a sort of length that one can imagine fitting an encounter between two human beings. And for me, the sort of a short novel can do that, and I'm attracted to that. One other thing is, of course, that when I don't write very quickly, and I don't read very quickly, and when I was a small child, they thought I couldn't write, in fact. And so I had all these difficulties with writing, and I was eventually told to just block print in capital letters and not to worry about cursive script and not to worry about my spelling. And so I would, write these very short answers to things. I had to learn to take notes in class much more slowly than everybody else. I had to learn how to write papers. In those days, you didn't do them on computer at Princeton and Harvard Law, much slower than everybody else. We would hand in 3 or 4 blue books at the end of an exam, and I would hand in 1. And one of the things that happens in a way, I think I often tell young students who tell me that they have difficulty with school, is that the thing that is the biggest challenge for you, in my case, writing, may very well turn out to be your superpower. Because when you aren't immediately good at something, you figure out ways of doing it for yourself. And I guess for me, as somebody who wasn't really good at writing, my way of doing it was to write very compressed, small things that hopefully said a lot in small space, because I didn't have the ability, I guess, to write big things when I was younger.
Well, look, thank you for being a fantastic guest on Always Take Notes, and wishing you all the best with the new novel and with your other projects going forward.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Mohsin Hamid. His website is mohsinhamid.com, and his new novel, The Last White Man, is published by Hamish Hamilton. Hello, it's us again. Rachel, what was your takeaway from the interview?
I thought Mohsin was a particularly thoughtful observer of his craft. I really enjoyed the fact that we delved into everything from sort of the makeup of his sentences to the efficiency of his novels, as he calls it. So I felt that was an area that we don't always delve into as much with novelists, and he was particularly forthcoming on that front, as well as his own reading and the work that he puts into each book. How about you?
I was really interested in him as someone who made this move from the corporate to the literary world, and that's something that certainly a lot of people I knew at university kind of said they were going to do or fantasized about doing, and almost exclusively have not done. And I was interested that he had pulled off that kind of complicated life change in how he'd done it. And then also, as the perennial theme on the podcast, of speaking to someone about what the experience of a huge multinational hit was like, in that case, The Reluctant Fundamentalist. And again, he was kind of candid and went into it. So I think a great addition to our collection. Anyway, Rachel, what have you been up to?
Well, this is the end of the year. It's the last episode of 2022. So I'm now on my Christmas holidays, although technically I'm on duty should any sort of cultural disaster strike. I guess we should take the opportunity to thank listeners for supporting us this year, and the guests that have generously appeared on our show. What have you been up to, Simon?
I was thinking, Rachel, you're constantly braced for cultural disaster, 24/7, 365,
yeah,
ready.
My pulse is just sky high at all times.
When the bat signal is raised, you
it's a
jump
book
into
signal.
action. Yes, exactly. I am not on holiday yet, unfortunately. I will be as of Friday. I'm wrapping up bits of work for the end of the year and bits of planning and admin before going off to the mountains. But I'd also like to say, a huge thank you to everyone who's been on the show as a guest and who's listened, and also to Rachel for being such a pleasure to work with over the past.
Oh, likewise, Simon.
Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acomb.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media is Artemis Irvin, who we'd also like to say a big thank you to for all her work in 2022.
Huge thank you.
Our score is by Jess Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to support us on Patreon, we're on there under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.